South Sudan government rejected the UN Security Council resolution to send more peacekeepers to South Sudan and also to let peacekeepers take all necessary means to protect peacekeeping and also the civilians in South Sudan. What do you make of it?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's a laudable effort for the Security Council to have voted and made the decision to send more forces into Juba. The situation there is extremely bad. The two leaders, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, are not seeing eye to eye. Their troops are massacring civilians, particularly children and women. And something has got to be done. Some sense has got to be put in their heads. And the only thing is to have troops in there. And it's rather difficult if these troops will only go with a peacekeeping mandate. They have to go and enforce some kind of peace. And this is a challenge with most of the United Nations peacekeeping missions around the world, that they are not fully equipped to be able to enforce peace in wherever place they're sent. And one of those areas is Southern Sudan.
Mr. Adams, what do you make of the latest situation in South Sudan, especially the dispute and disagreement between the South Sudan government and the UN Security Council?
Well, look, I think the UN mission there, UNMISS, is in a very unenviable position. It's basically trying to uphold the peace when there's very little peace to actually uphold. The government and the rebel forces, even though they signed a peace agreement last August, it's clear that there's only sort of lukewarm support amongst their upper echelons for that peace agreement, and a lot of people think that they would like nothing better than to go back to fighting, which would also mean going back to atrocities and to the ethnic targeting that we've seen over the last 2 years. So in that situation, for many people, even though I think UNMISS has really struggled to uphold its mandate, for many people, the UN mission, peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, is the difference between life and death.
Right, it is. But the thing is, what can peacekeepers do, especially when they're ill-equipped with all necessary means? So, Ms. He, given your understanding of the African situation, you travel there very frequently in South Sudan as well. Tell me about what are the responsibilities and also the means peacekeepers of the UN have over there, given the fact that the two top leadership of that country do not see eye to one another.
Right. Literally speaking, peacekeeping should be to keep a peace. So the precondition is there is a peace there already, and then those peacekeepers and by the UN, and then to separate those two parties, and then to maintain the peace. But unfortunately, in South Sudan, there is no peace there. So that's why make this peacekeeper themselves become a target from the both sides. When they have the anger to the other side, and then they may take the peacekeeper of the UN as the target, because those peacekeepers, they become so obvious. They have their camp there, headquarters there, and they know the routine, how to patrol. So it's very easy, even compared with the other side, their combat parties. So the peacekeepers is becoming very fragile, weak team. Yes. So that's why I think from the South Sudan issue, maybe that's another test place for UN trying to think further how to expand those peacekeepers, their mission, and how to make them powerful to protect themselves first.
Well, Mr. Ali, I mean, that is the crisis, isn't it? I mean, when we say crisis, it's not the crisis of the UN peacekeepers, but rather the UN identity in a way. What role should the UN peacekeepers play overall in a country like that? What kinds of responsibilities, what kind of means should they be equipped with? Well, at the same time, they still need to be neutral all the time. Will they be able to exercise their military means against those attackers? To what degree? When it comes to protecting civilians, how could they identify civilians vis-a-vis militaries? These could all be very blurred water and blurred lines over there. Mr. Ali.
Yeah, and the roles and responsibilities for the United Nations peacekeepers should be varied according to the threat levels in any particular context or situation. In the case of South Sudan, first of all, the United Nations should not have let the country slip into the all-out war that the soldiers belonging to Riek Machar and Salva Kiir are now fighting each other. That should have been prevented. The situation, the kind of agreements that was signed between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar was actually bound to cause some friction between those two groups that are competing for power. Now, the United Nations should play a much bigger role in preventing conflicts. Now, whenever conflict have occurred and violent conflict for that, it's very difficult for United Nations to keep on staying there without any peace to keep. And therefore, the kind of mandate that should be given to the United Nations should actually be changed from that of peacekeeping to peace enforcement, so that they are able to enforce peace in areas where belligerents, in this case Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, have refused to disarm and to demobilize. One of the things that the United Nations should be asked to do is to precisely do what happened in Ivory Coast, disarm the soldiers belonging to Gbagbo, and arrest the people or the leaders who are insisting that they must continue fighting and harming civilians.
Well, Mr. Ali, certainly what you're saying makes sense, but at the same time, the United Nations does have a big role to maintain peace, but also to neutral in a way, as long as the people there will not be extremely hurt. So the question is, Mr. Adams, once again, it's an identity. What kind of identity should the UN have? Can the UN be able to prevent crisis from happening? It seems that what Mr. Ali has been suggesting. And can the UN, in a way, try to deal with who is in power, which seems to at least goes beyond what the UN's responsibilities should be, and probably violate UN's role as a neutral player over there. Mr. Adams.
Yeah, look, I think UN
Nations,
peacekeeping has changed.
Mr. Adams.
And that we have to... Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think UN peacekeeping has changed, and we have to acknowledge that. The old days of a kind of a white line drawn, abstractly in the sand, and of two armies facing off against each other, and of peacekeepers walking peacefully by with blue berets, those days, if they ever existed, are definitely gone. The reality is that 10 out of the 16 UN peacekeeping missions at the moment have protection of civilians or responsibility to protect built into their mandates. They're in situations of potential armed conflict where civilians are under threat. That's the reality of peacekeeping. And the problem is not so much the question of a violation of neutrality, although I think that's very important to raise that issue. The problem, which the UN itself has acknowledged in its own internal review, looking at peacekeeping between the last couple of years, is that there's been more than 500 incidents in UN peacekeeping missions where civilians were attacked and where peacekeepers did not respond. And so what I think we need to do, and I think that the crisis of peacekeeping at the moment, is that even though it has expanded massively, it's a question of why are peacekeepers there, and the fundamental priority for UN peacekeepers has got to be that when people see that blue flag and the blue helmets, that they know that they'll be protected. They have to know that they will not be abandoned and left to people who want to prey upon civilians.
Well, Ms. He here in Beijing, China has begun its mission to play a role in the world peacekeeping and has been a great contributor for that cause. And yet China already suffered quite a number of casualties among its peacekeepers for the UN. Of course, these are devastating issues for the Chinese to digest. And yet, on the other hand, there are a lot of thoughts going on about what should be the role of the peacekeeping for the UN. Do you agree with the other two gentlemen? Do you also have concerns when the UN's role of peacekeeping expanding at this moment? What is the limitation and what should be the real responsibilities?
Yes, first of all, China has contributed a great deal for this peacekeeping career in globally speaking. But I think there should be the boundary for this expansion of UN peacekeeping's mission. Actually, you couldn't be just one party to join the fighting with the other, all those conflicts and fighters. So I think countries' situation are different. Like the Ivory Coast, our colleagues mentioned, that's totally different with the situation in South Sudan, because in South Sudan, it's a reconciliation government has been established. So they are now becoming one identity. So you cannot say get in and then support who and who. So that's totally different. Now it's a big, big challenge for UN, even Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General himself, how to figure out those boundaries, where it is, where it should be limitation. So because different situations are different, it should be different approach to deal with.
And yet that comes the challenge, isn't it? Every
Yes.
time you have to study the areas and all parties have to agree with the role of the UN peacekeepers and therefore to implement exactly what the responsibilities
Right.
are. And during this process, there could be a lot of different views going on, and yet we need efficiency when it comes to UN peacekeepers
Exactly,
as
yes.
well. Having said that, though, there has also been another dispute going on about the identity of UN peacekeepers. Mr. Adams, for example, the UN Security Council recently has do this proposal to have this resolution adding 4,000 to 5,000 more peacekeepers to South Sudan. And that has been rejected by the current South Sudan government. They used the suggestion that, well, many of those peacekeepers might be coming from African countries, and therefore they probably have already in their hearts a stance before they come into that country. But the thing is, UN has to use people from the localities to really safeguard the peace of some of the troubling countries in the region. So what do you make of this kinds of controversy? This is not just going to be just in Africa, it can also be in any other region of the world.
Right, absolutely. And just on the question that's been raised about UN peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping has grown enormously and it has grown more expensive, but we should keep it in context. UN peacekeeping costs about $8 billion a year. That's probably less than the amount that Americans spend on ice cream. I don't know the exact figures that Americans spend on ice cream, but the point is that it's, all things considered, it's relatively cheap, and it makes a huge difference in terms of the capacity to actually save people's lives. Look, I think what the Security Council was trying to do, I actually applaud the decision that they made. They're in a very desperate situation, caught between, as everyone has mentioned, all the other panelists have mentioned, two armies who don't really want to make peace with one another. We have something like 100,000 civilians who are actually taking shelter on or around UN bases. And so the extra troops are part of a regional protection force, and I think that's a move that should be applauded. The question is, will the IGAD, which is the regional organization, will other African countries actually be willing to contribute those troops, and will the South Sudanese government be willing to accept them? And I think that, again, gets to the whole core of this issue, which is how do you uphold peace in a situation where there is no peace? And the government has sent very mixed signals. You know, it says it agrees one minute, it says it disagrees. But I think, you know, there absolutely needs to be a regional protection force, and we absolutely need to see greater protection for civilians in South Sudan.
Ms. He, here's the thing. People look at the UN and say, you are such a big international important organization, do something about all the crises. That's the first resort. And people also go to the UN as the last resort. They say, well, we are totally desperate, so please do something. And yet the UN has to maintain certain kind of mandate in order to be functional. So here is once again this identity crisis we have been talking about.
Yeah, that's a huge gap between this high expectation and also those limited capacity that the UN peacekeepers can do. Now we have been discussing about this boundary of their mission. It's there. That's a fact. We cannot ignore saying now UN peacekeepers can do everything. They have the magic power, can prevent those conflicts and stop those killing immediately. I think that's naive thinking. So we have to realize that, for example, case by case, this South Sudan issue, because it has a lot of killing, now has been happening there. Civilians died, and even peacekeepers themselves now died by those attackers.
And
now,
aid workers as well.
Yes, and Chinese peacekeepers died as well. You see heaviest casualties. So now that's why the UN passed this resolution, saying they have to expand the mission that the UN peacekeepers there. They have to be a power to protect themselves first. Otherwise, how could they protect those civilians? They rush to their compound trying to get those help from those peacekeepers. So I think in this case, because those fighting troops, they are out of their boundary as well. They go first, and then peacekeepers have to follow those game of the war. So I think in this case, UN can try to explore the boundary limitation.
Right.
So through the experience building from those cases, and then they will add a theory building.
I see. Interesting. We'll see how the developments are going. But having said that, though, Mr. Ali, here is also the issue by the other two panelists. They raised the question, what about the regional forces? What about countries in the region? Where are they? Are they working together with the UN, or are they just try to leave all the chaoses to the UN and peacekeepers to handle, which could be a very devastating situation, Mr. Ali?
Sorry, I didn't hear your question properly. But if it's about the enormity of the work and responsibility before the United Nations.
What about the regional powers? What about countries in the region? What about organizations in the region? Are they also working together with the UN before finger pointing?
Yeah, and thank you very much. Just coming into that, what will really help the United Nations to address the conflicts that are regional specific are the regional organizations. For example, the African Union. Within Africa, we have IGAD, ECOWAS, East African Community, and other sub-regional bodies. If the United Nations is going to work more closely with these regional organizations, give them the mandate that the United Security Council that is providing to the United Nations, and ensure that there are adequate resources to, for example, IGAD and African Union. They might be able to handle some of the challenges that are regional specific and leave the United Nations to handle the more global issues that require United Nations attention as an organization that is not interfering with the affairs of other states.
Very interesting. We are almost reaching the end of our discussion, but there are many issues related to UN peacekeeping that we haven't asked. Yet, there's one thing we really need to ask Mr. Adams. We are seeing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, together with his mission, likely to wrap up by the end of the year. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has recognized the challenges through his office and spokesperson of the peacekeeping, and suggesting UN should work on the updates of the systems and peacekeeping missions. And yet time is limited. What do you expect Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to achieve within his term? And what about the enormous amount of responsibilities also for the upcoming one, which is of course in the process being of selection?
Yeah, look, I think Ban Ki-moon, of course, authorized a high-level panel to review peacekeeping and to look at where it was at. That happened last year. There were a series of recommendations that came out from that review, which I think are very good. They're very sensible recommendations. There's also been real moves. A number of states, 35 states, have signed up to something called the Kigali Principles, which hasn't been mentioned here today, but which are really about putting the protection of civilians absolutely at the center of UN peacekeeping, and recognizing that this is the future of UN peacekeeping, whether we like it or not. It's not like anybody wants to send their troops into dangerous circumstances to protect civilians on the other side of the world, but it's necessary. And I salute, by the way, the role that China has played. It's now the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping amongst the permanent 5 members, over 2,000 troops. And of course, it was very sad that 2 Chinese peacekeepers were killed recently in South Sudan. But I think it's now a question of what the next Secretary General will do. And I think they really need to look at what peacekeeping means in the 21st century. And in some ways, the UN is still a Remington typewriter organization in a smartphone world, to quote somebody else. But I think that this question of what will civilian protection and UN peacekeeping look like in the 21st century is something that all the candidates are focused on. I mean, I've had the opportunity to meet with 11 of the candidates. I know that this is very much at the top of the agenda of all of them.
Yeah, and before we go, Ms. He as well, what do you think the future challenges?
Yeah, I think there are 3 kinds of peacemaking things. One is peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. So now peacemaking should be given high priority. That is to negotiation, to prevention of those conflicts. I think that's the thing we need to focus.